That night, in the backstage area of London's music festival, Beatles legend Paul McCartney was speaking to journalists about Ozzy Osbourne. "This man is not a real musician, he just makes noise," he said with a dismissive tone. McCartney had no idea that just a few meters away, Ozzy was standing silently, listening to every word. But when Paul made those mocking words, a strange smile appeared on Ozzy's face, because the Beatles legend didn't yet know that the melody he would hear that evening would forever destroy all his prejudices about music. The Roundhouse in London buzzed with an electric atmosphere that warm September evening. The annual Legends of Music Festival had brought together some of the most iconic names in the industry for a celebration of musical heritage. Outside, fans lined the streets, hoping for glimpses of their heroes, while inside, the backstage area hummed with conversations between music royalty. Paul McCartney, now 56, and still carrying the weight of being a Beatle, moved through the backstage corridors with his characteristic measured confidence. His recent album Flaming Pie had been well received by critics, reaffirming his position as one of music's most respected songwriters. Tonight, he was scheduled to perform a set of Beatles classics alongside some of his solo work. The backstage area was divided into different sections, with classical musicians occupying one corner, pop stars clustered around the catering table, and rock musicians gathered near the equipment area. It was a clear delineation that spoke to the unspoken hierarchies within the music world, and Paul felt comfortable in his position at the top of that hierarchy. Standing with a group of music journalists from Rolling Stone and NME, Paul was in his element. These were the people who understood real music, who could appreciate the craftsmanship that went into creating lasting songs. The conversation had naturally turned to the state of contemporary music, and Paul was sharing his thoughts with the eloquence that came from decades of interviews and public appearances. "You know," Paul said, adjusting his jacket and speaking with the authority of someone whose opinions carried weight throughout the industry, "there's a real difference between musicianship and entertainment. Some artists understand the craft, the art of songwriting, the subtlety of arrangement. Others just rely on volume and spectacle." The journalists leaned in, sensing a story. Paul McCartney's opinions on music were always newsworthy, and his willingness to speak candidly about other artists was relatively rare. They knew that whatever he said next would likely become a headline by morning. Martin Fisher from Rolling Stone prompted Paul to elaborate. "Are you thinking of anyone in particular, Sir Paul?" Paul glanced around the backstage area, his eyes settling on a figure in dark clothing, standing alone near the sound equipment. Even from a distance, the long hair and distinctive silhouette were unmistakable. It was Ozzy Osbourne, scheduled to perform later that evening as part of a heavy metal legends segment. "Well, take someone like Ozzy Osbourne," Paul said, his voice carrying clearly across the relatively quiet backstage area. "I mean, I understand he has his fans, but let's be honest about what we're dealing with here. This man is not a real musician. He just makes noise." The journalists quickly pulled out their recording devices and notepads, recognizing they were witnessing something significant. Paul McCartney publicly criticizing another major artist was unusual, and his choice of target made it even more newsworthy. "When I think about the Beatles, about the care we put into harmonies, the attention we gave to melody, the literary quality of our lyrics," Paul continued, warming to his theme, "and then I see what passes for music today. It's disheartening. Artists like Osbourne have taken music backward, not forward." Sarah Williams from NME asked the follow-up question that would make this encounter legendary. "So you don't consider heavy metal to be legitimate music?" Paul shook his head with the certainty of someone who had spent his entire adult life creating music that was studied in universities and celebrated by critics worldwide. "Heavy metal, as practiced by people like Osbourne, is just noise organized around a marketing strategy. There's no subtlety, no nuance, no real understanding of musical principles. It's entertainment masquerading as art." The circle of journalists grew larger as word spread that Paul McCartney was giving an impromptu interview with particularly candid opinions. Photographers began appearing, capturing images of the Beatles legend, speaking passionately about the state of modern music. "I've been making music for nearly 40 years, Paul said, his voice carrying the weight of his experience. "I've worked with the greatest musicians of multiple generations. Real musicianship requires discipline, study, and an understanding of the craft that goes back centuries. What Ozzy Osbourne does is essentially karaoke with pyrotechnics." What Paul didn't realize, and what the journalists were too focused on their story to notice, was that his words were carrying across the backstage area with perfect clarity. The acoustics of the space, combined with the relative quiet of the late afternoon, meant that every word was audible to anyone within 50 feet. Ozzy Osbourne stood alone near a rack of guitar cases, ostensibly checking his equipment, but actually listening to every word of Paul's impromptu press conference. His expression was unreadable behind his characteristic dark glasses, but those who knew him well might have recognized the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth. At 59, Ozzy had heard criticism before, decades of it in fact, from religious groups who called his music satanic, from parents who blamed him for corrupting their children, from music critics who dismissed heavy metal as a lesser form of art. He had developed a thick skin about such attacks, but hearing them from Paul McCartney, someone he had actually admired since his youth in Birmingham, struck a different chord. Ozzy's mind drifted back to his teenage years, when he would save every penny to buy Beatles records. Yesterday, Let It Be, The Long and Winding Road. These songs had been among his earliest musical influences. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. One of his musical heroes was now publicly dismissing everything he had worked to achieve. But rather than anger or hurt, Ozzy felt something else entirely, a sense of opportunity, a chance to bridge a gap that had existed in the music world for too long. He had learned, through years of controversy and misunderstanding, that the best response to criticism wasn't defensiveness or counterattack, but demonstration. As Paul's impromptu interview continued, Ozzy quietly made his way toward the piano that sat in the corner of the backstage area. It was a beautiful Steinway grand, placed there for any artist who might want to warm up or work through arrangements before their performance. Most of the rock and metal musicians ignored it entirely, but Ozzy had always been drawn to the instrument. As Paul's interview began to wind down, the journalists having gotten their quotes and photos, Ozzy made his move. He approached the group slowly, his presence gradually noticed by the outer ring of onlookers. A murmur went through the small crowd as people recognized him, and several photographers quickly repositioned themselves to capture what might be a confrontation between two music legends. "Excuse me," Ozzy said in his distinctive Birmingham accent, his voice calm and polite. "Sir Paul, might I have a word?" The journalists sensed drama and instinctively moved closer, but Paul, to his credit, gestured for them to give the two musicians some space. Whatever was about to happen, it should happen between the artists themselves, not as a public spectacle for the press. Paul turned to face Ozzy directly, and for a moment, the two men simply looked at each other. They represented two different eras of music, two different approaches to artistry, two different philosophies about what music should be and do. The tension was palpable, but it wasn't hostile. It was the tension of anticipation. "I heard what you said," Ozzy began, his voice steady and without accusation, "about my music, about heavy metal, about what you consider to be real musicianship." Paul straightened slightly, prepared to defend his position, but also curious about where this conversation might lead. "I was simply expressing my opinion about the current state of music. Nothing personal, you understand." Ozzy nodded slowly. "I understand completely, and I respect your opinion, Sir Paul. You've created some of the most beautiful music ever recorded. The Beatles changed everything, including my own understanding of what music could be." This response clearly surprised Paul, who had been expecting either anger or defensiveness. The respect in Ozzy's voice was genuine, and it immediately changed the dynamic of their interaction. "But," Ozzy continued, "I wonder if you might be willing to hear something before you make your final judgment about what I do and don't understand about music." Paul found himself intrigued despite his preconceptions. There was something in Ozzy's demeanor, a quiet confidence mixed with genuine respect, that made him curious about what the metal icon had in mind. "What did you have in mind?" Paul asked. Ozzy gestured toward the Steinway piano. "Just a song, something I've been working on. No amplifiers, no effects, no pyrotechnics, just music." The backstage area had grown quiet, with conversations stopping as people became aware of the interaction between the two legends. Even the crew members paused in their preparations, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Paul looked around at the gathered crowd, then back at Ozzy. The Beatles legend had always prided himself on being fair-minded, and turning down such a simple request would seem petty and closed-minded. Besides, his curiosity was genuinely piqued. What could Ozzy Osbourne possibly play on a piano that would change his mind about heavy metal? "All right," Paul said. "I'm listening." Ozzy nodded and walked to the piano, settling onto the bench with a familiarity that surprised many of the onlookers. Most people associated him exclusively with microphones and wild stage performances, not with the intimate act act of sitting at a piano. As Ozzy adjusted the bench and flexed his fingers, Paul moved closer, positioning himself where he could both see and hear clearly. The journalists, photographers, and other musicians formed a loose semicircle around the piano, everyone understanding that they were about to witness something unusual. Ozzy placed his hands on the keys and paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, or perhaps his courage. Then, without any introduction or explanation, he began to play. The first notes were soft, delicate, and immediately recognizable as sophisticated piano composition. This wasn't the simple chord progression that many rock musicians might play, but rather a complex, classically influenced piece that demonstrated real understanding of piano technique and musical theory. But it was when Ozzy began to sing that the real magic happened. His voice, stripped of all amplification and effects, revealed itself to be a remarkably expressive instrument. The song he had chosen was Mama, I'm Coming Home, but not as anyone had ever heard it before. The original version of the song, released in 1991, had been a radio-friendly rock ballad about longing and redemption, but this piano-only arrangement revealed layers of meaning and musical sophistication that had been hidden beneath the original's rock production. Ozzy's voice, soft and vulnerable, carried every word with genuine emotion. Paul found himself transfixed. The melody was beautiful, sophisticated, and emotionally powerful. The lyrics, which he had always dismissed as simple rock cliches, revealed themselves to be a deeply personal meditation on loss, guilt, and the search for redemption. And Ozzy's performance was not just technically competent, but genuinely moving. As the song progressed, Ozzy began to add subtle variations to the arrangement, demonstrating an understanding of musical development that belied Paul's assumptions about his abilities. The way he built tension through harmonic progression, the way he used dynamics to create emotional peaks and valleys, the way he integrated melody and lyrics into a cohesive artistic statement. It was all there, all the elements that Paul considered essential to real musicianship. But Ozzy wasn't finished. As Mama, I'm Coming Home concluded to absolute silence, he seamlessly transitioned into another song, one that no one in the audience had heard before. This was clearly a new composition, something Ozzy had been working on privately, away from the expectations and commercial pressures of his public career. The new song was even more sophisticated than the first, incorporating jazz-influenced harmonies and classical structural elements. The lyrics spoke of growing older, of looking back on a life lived in public, of the struggle to remain authentic while meeting others' expectations. It was deeply personal and universally relatable at the same time. Paul listened with growing amazement as Ozzy demonstrated not just technical skill, but genuine artistry. This was composition and performance of the highest order, created by someone who clearly understood music theory, classical tradition, and the subtle arts of songcraft that Paul himself valued so highly. As the second song concluded, Ozzy played a brief transition and then began something that made Paul's jaw drop. A piano arrangement of Yesterday, one of Paul's own most beloved compositions. But this wasn't a simple cover version. It was a complete reimagining of the song, maintaining its essential emotional core while exploring new harmonic possibilities and melodic variations. Hearing his own song interpreted with such intelligence and creativity was a humbling experience for Paul. Ozzy had clearly studied the original carefully, understood its strengths and subtleties, and then found ways to honor it while making it his own. This wasn't the work of someone who didn't understand music. This was the work of a serious musician with deep respect for the craft. When Ozzy finished playing, the backstage area remained completely silent for several long moments. The gathered musicians, journalists, and crew members had all been expecting something very different, perhaps a confrontational performance designed to prove a point through volume and aggression. Instead, they had witnessed something much more powerful, a demonstration of artistry that transcended genre boundaries and challenged everyone's preconceptions. Paul stood frozen, his mind reeling as he processed what he had just heard. Everything he had said about Ozzy just 30 minutes earlier now seemed not just wrong, but embarrassingly ignorant. This man, whom he had dismissed as a mere entertainer, had just displayed musical knowledge and ability that rivaled any classically trained composer. Ozzy sat quietly at the piano bench, his hands still resting on the keys, waiting for some response. He wasn't looking for applause or validation. He had simply wanted to communicate, musician to musician, in the language they both spoke best. Finally, Paul approached the piano, his expression serious and thoughtful. The gathered crowd watched as the two legends faced each other across the instrument that had become a bridge between their different worlds. "That was," Paul began, then stopped, seeming to struggle for words adequate to express what he was feeling. "That was extraordinary." Ozzy nodded slightly. "Music is music, Sir Paul. Whether it's played on a piano in a quiet room or through Marshall amplifiers in a stadium, the principles are the same. Melody, harmony, rhythm, emotion, these things don't change based on volume or instrumentation." Paul gestured to a pair of chairs near the piano, and the two men sat down for what would become one of the most significant conversations in rock music history. The journalists and photographers, sensing this was now a private moment, backed away slightly while still trying to capture the historic interaction. "I owe you an apology," Paul said simply. "What I said earlier was based on ignorance, not knowledge. I made assumptions about your music without taking the time to understand what you were actually doing." Ozzy smiled, a genuine expression of warmth and understanding. "No apology necessary. I've been dealing with misconceptions about my music for 30 years. Most people hear the volume and the energy and assume that's all there is. But you know as well as anyone that the best rock music has always been built on solid musical foundations." "Tell me about your background," Paul requested. "How did you learn to play like that?" Ozzy settled back in his chair, clearly comfortable sharing his story with someone who now seemed genuinely interested in understanding rather than judging. "I grew up in Birmingham, in Aston," Ozzy began. "Working class family, no money for formal lessons. But I was obsessed with music from an early age. I taught myself guitar, but I was always drawn to piano as well. There's something about the completeness of the instrument. You can play bass lines, melodies, harmonies, all at the same time." Paul nodded, understanding exactly what Ozzy meant. His own relationship with piano had been similarly foundational to his musical development. "When Black Sabbath started getting successful," Ozzy continued, "I had more resources to study music properly. I worked with classical piano teachers, studied composition, learned about different harmonic traditions, not because I wanted to abandon rock music, but because I wanted to make it better, more sophisticated." "That's exactly what we did with the Beatles," Paul said, the parallel becoming clear. "We started as a simple rock band, but we kept pushing ourselves to learn more, to incorporate different influences, to grow as musicians." As their conversation continued, both men began to realize how much they actually had in common. Both had started from working class backgrounds and used music as their path to a better life. Both had faced criticism for pushing boundaries and refusing to stay within expected parameters. Both had struggled with the tension between commercial success and artistic integrity. "You know," Paul said, "when we made Sgt. Pepper, the classical music establishment dismissed it as pop nonsense. They couldn't see past the electric instruments and rock rhythms to appreciate the musical sophistication we were trying to achieve." "Exactly," Ozzy replied. "And when we made Paranoid or Iron Man, the rock establishment couldn't hear the blues foundations, the classical influences, the careful attention to melody and structure. They just heard the heaviness and assumed we were just making noise." Paul was beginning to understand that the divide between their types of music wasn't as fundamental as he had believed. Both were working within popular music traditions. Both were trying to create art that was accessible but sophisticated. Both were dealing with similar challenges and misconceptions. "Play something else," Paul requested. "Something heavier, something more representative of what you do on stage." Ozzy returned to the piano and began playing a stripped-down version of Iron Man, one of Black Sabbath's most famous songs, but arranged for solo piano. The song revealed its true structure, a sophisticated blues-based composition with clever harmonic movements and a melody that was both memorable and musically substantial. As Ozzy played, Paul found himself analyzing the song with the same attention he would give to any piece of music he respected. The chord progressions were intelligent, the melodic development was logical and satisfying, and the overall structure showed real understanding of how to build and release musical tension. "You know what I'm realizing," Paul said as Ozzy finished the song. "The problem isn't with your music, or with heavy metal in general. The problem is with how it's presented and perceived. When you strip away the volume and the visual spectacle, the underlying music is often quite sophisticated." Ozzy nodded enthusiastically. "That's been my frustration for years. People make judgments based on surface elements, the leather, the darkness, the volume, without listening to what's actually happening musically. They assume that because it's loud and energetic, it can't be intelligent or well-crafted. It's the same prejudice that jazz jazz musicians faced in the 1940s, Paul observed. Critics dismissed it as jungle music because it was associated with African American culture and nightclub environments. They couldn't hear the incredible sophistication of the harmonies and improvisations, and it's the same prejudice that folk musicians faced when Bob Dylan went electric. Ozzy added, people were so focused on the change in instrumentation that they couldn't hear that the songs themselves were still brilliant. Paul was struck by Ozzy's knowledge of music history and his ability to place his own work within broader cultural and artistic contexts. This wasn't the mindless entertainer he had imagined, but rather a thoughtful artist with deep understanding of his craft and its place in the larger musical world. As their private conversation continued, the backstage area had gradually returned to its normal bustle of pre-show preparation. But word of what had happened spread quickly throughout the venue, and by the time both men were scheduled to perform, the entire festival was buzzing with anticipation. When Paul took the stage for his set, he did something unprecedented. After performing several Beatles classics to the expected rapturous response, he called for the house lights to be brought up slightly and addressed the audience directly. Tonight I learned something important about music and about making assumptions, Paul began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed venue. Earlier today, I made some comments about heavy metal music and about Ozzy Osbourne in particular that I now realize were unfair and uninformed. A murmur went through the crowd as people tried to process what they were hearing. Paul McCartney admitting he was wrong in public was almost unprecedented. I want to tell you that Ozzy Osbourne is not just a great entertainer, but a serious and sophisticated musician. Paul continued, the complexity and artistry of his work became clear to me only when I took the time to really listen, to look past surface assumptions, and hear what he was actually creating. The audience was now completely focused, understanding they were witnessing something historically significant. Music is music, Paul said, echoing Ozzy's words from backstage. Whether it's performed by the London Symphony Orchestra or by a heavy metal band, the principles of melody, harmony, and emotional truth remain the same. I apologize to Ozzy, to his fans, and to anyone else who might have been influenced by my narrow-minded comments earlier today. The applause that followed was unlike anything the venue had heard that night. Not just appreciation for Paul's humility, but recognition that they had witnessed a genuine moment of growth and understanding from one of music's most respected figures. When Ozzy took the stage later that evening, he too addressed what had happened backstage, but characteristically, his approach was different from Paul's formal apology. Tonight I had the honor of sharing some music with Paul McCartney, Ozzy told the audience, and I want to say something about that man. He showed me what real class looks like. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and it takes wisdom to change your mind when presented with new information. The crowd cheered, appreciating both the grace of Ozzy's response and the mutual respect that had developed between the two artists. But more than that, Ozzy continued, what happened tonight shows why music is so important. Music breaks down barriers. Music helps us understand each other. Music reminds us that we have more in common than we think. For his performance that night, Ozzy did something he had never done before. At a festival like this, he performed an acoustic set, accompanying himself on guitar and piano, demonstrating to the wider audience the same musical sophistication he had shown Paul backstage. Songs like Mama, I'm Coming Home and Dreamer took on new dimensions when stripped of their heavy arrangements, revealing the strong melodic and lyrical foundations that had always been there. In the days following the festival, the story of Paul and Ozzy's backstage encounter became international news. Music magazines, newspapers, and television programs all covered the story, using it as a jumping-off point for broader discussions about musical prejudice, artistic respect, and the artificial boundaries that separate different genres and audiences. Paul McCartney gave several follow-up interviews in which he expanded on his change of perspective. What I learned from Ozzy is that good music transcends genre labels, he told Rolling Stone. The question isn't whether something is rock or classical or pop or metal. The question is whether it's well-crafted, emotionally honest, and meaningful to the people who hear it. Ozzy, for his part, used the increased attention to discuss the broader issue of musical prejudice. People make assumptions about all kinds of music based on things that have nothing to do with the actual quality of the art, he told NME. They dismiss country music as simple, or jazz as pretentious, or classical as boring, without really listening to what's being created. The encounter between Paul McCartney and Ozzy Osbourne became a turning point in how different musical genres were perceived and discussed in the media. Music critics began to approach genre genre boundaries with more nuance and less prejudice. Radio programmers started experimenting with more diverse playlists. Music educators began incorporating popular music analysis into their curricula. More importantly, the story became a symbol of the power of open-minded listening and respectful dialogue. In an era when cultural and political divisions seemed to be hardening, the image of two music legends from different worlds finding common ground resonated far beyond the music industry. Both men remained friends after their initial encounter, occasionally performing together and always speaking respectfully of each other's work in interviews. Their backstage conversation had lasted only an hour, but its effects rippled through the music world for years to come. Years later, when asked about that night in London, both Paul and Ozzy would reflect on how much they had learned from each other. Paul spoke about how the encounter had opened his ears to musical possibilities he had previously dismissed, while Ozzy appreciated having his artistry recognized by someone whose opinion he deeply respected. The real lesson, Paul would say in a later interview, is that we should never assume we understand something without taking the time to really examine it. I had decades of experience in music, but I was still capable of being completely wrong about something I hadn't properly investigated. Ozzy's reflection was characteristically more direct. Paul McCartney taught me that even the most successful, respected artists can change their minds when they're presented with new information. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. The story of their encounter became legendary, not because it involved two famous musicians, but because it demonstrated something essential about human nature, our capacity to overcome prejudice through genuine communication and mutual respect. In the end, that backstage piano performance did more than change Paul McCartney's mind about Ozzy Osbourne. It reminded everyone who heard the story that music, at its best, is about connection rather than division, understanding rather than judgment, and the courage to remain open to new possibilities even when our preconceptions tell us otherwise. The melody that Ozzy played that night didn't just change Paul's perspective on heavy metal. It changed both men's understanding of what it means to be a true musician in a world that too often values categories over artistry, prejudice over perception, and assumptions over authentic listening.